You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on Exodus. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, who's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
And it's baparek. It means in violent slavery.
Wow.
I found a word that I thought, wow, this is what I had never seen before. Thought we better look at it.
Yeah.
So it says, the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. That's our word.
Okay.
And they made their lives bitter with the hard labor and mortar and bricks and at all kinds of labor in the field and all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. I thought, that is kind of amazing. But then I found out it's used like 5 times, or maybe 6. 2 of them are right here.
Yeah.
But look at the other ones. Leviticus 25:43 says, "You shall not rule over them an Israelite slave," that's who they're talking about, "with severity." It's that word.
Oh, wow.
So you're not so what Egypt was doing to Israel was never supposed to do to their own people.
Right.
Okay? Leviticus 25:46 says pretty much the same thing. "In respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another." So it's that same thing. Leviticus 25:53, "Like a man hired year by year, he, the Israelite slave, shall be with him. He shall not rule over him with severity in your sight."
That's all 3 from Leviticus 25.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, there's one more in Ezekiel saying that the false shepherds, not those who are sickly among you, they have not strengthened. The diseased you have not healed. The broken you have not bound up. The scattered you have not brought back, nor have you sought for the lost, but with force and with severity you have dominated them. Remember, so in chapter 34, he's bawling out these false shepherds for treating the Israelites so bad. Now, the false shepherds were kings that they had that were not doing it right. So I thought it was really interesting. That word seemed like, oh man, so they're never supposed to do that to Israelite slaves, what the Egyptians did to them. And then now the false shepherds were doing it to them too.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really kind of a neat word.
That's a good one. Yeah, that's an intense word, you know?
Yeah. And usually you don't have something like that that's almost like a phrase, in violent slavery.
Right.
I was really surprised that even the lexicon calls it that.
Well, and it's interesting because it seems pretty, I guess maybe we should just go ahead and say it. We're in Exodus.
Yes. Oh, yes. Sorry.
Which it's probably, most people probably could get the hint, I think, there, and especially when it's talking about Egypt. But the translation we have up here from Exodus 1:13-14, to labor rigorously, it almost sounds soft. It's like a bit softer than kind of we even see it translated in Leviticus. Right.
And in here, that in violent slavery, that probably puts it more into perspective of what they were really doing to them too.
Right. So there's a brutality to it.
Yeah. Well, we're heading into Egypt, or out of Egypt. But I wanted you to know.
Maybe if we're doing some background, we can head into Egypt.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. They were this is about 300 years after what was talked about in Genesis.
Okay.
So, you go right into it and you don't realize that there's been quite a bit of time between these books.
Several generations.
Yeah. So I thought I'd better make sure they know that.
Yeah.
It's got 3 parts, basically. You've got Israel in Egypt, 1 through 12. Then you've got from Egypt to Sinai, and that's 12, about the middle, 12 through 18, and then a covenant on Mount Sinai, 19 through 40. So the rest, a long part of it is there. And it's a lot of specifics as to what the tabernacle is supposed to be and all that. Yeah. One other thing that I thought would be helpful is Moses spends about 40 years in Egypt. Okay. Then he's about 40 years in the Midian, where he's almost been removed from Egypt from that time. Yeah. Then probably about 40 years he goes back and leads the people. Wow. So that gives you some clue as his life was basically broken up into 3 parts. Yeah. Wow. So I thought that was helpful.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Now, so here's my 3 parts. God's purpose was to make the Israelites want to leave Egypt. So the whole first couple of chapters of Exodus make sure that they know they don't want to be there anymore.
Yeah.
Because remember, even when they start heading out, they keep saying, oh, if only we were back in Egypt. Right. So I think God made it so hard in Egypt that they remembered how bad it was. So at least when they complained, they at least realized, well, at least we're better off than we were.
Right.
So I thought that's helpful.
Yeah.
And then God wants to make a covenant with Israel. So that's kind of the two ends of it. He gets them out of Egypt so they can make this covenant, and in Mount Sinai is where they do the covenant.
Yeah.
So I thought that'd be helpful for you to know.
Yeah, big picture.
All right. I remember in the books now, we're just taking parts. We're not going all the way through. We're just taking ideas or parts. So what we're doing here is it says that the sons of Israel were 70 in number, and that came out of the loins of Jacob. So that's in Exodus 1:5. Acts actually tells us that there were 75 people that came out. So I was trying to figure out, well, who are these people? How come it's not the same?
Yeah.
So Jacob and his children would be 71 in number.
Okay.
Then Joseph and his wife, okay, because it actually says those who were in that were in Canaan that came to Egypt.
Yeah.
So we got Joseph and his wife, and then Joseph has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So that makes the 70.
That's 70
or 75.
75, yeah.
Yeah. So that's how you get it.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure people know that it's not an error. It's just a different way of counting them.
Yeah.
Of the same people.
Yeah.
All right. Now we've got some difficulties for you. What I wanted to do on this is when I was at Trinity, they taught me that Abraham lived about 2000 BC because that's what the culture kind of was about that time. And so by looking at that he was a wanderer and he's a sheep herder and all those kind of things, and that's how you counted their wealth, that's about when it was. Well, what I didn't realize...
Like in a historical sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I didn't realize is that the biblical text actually helps us get back to a much more specific time frame. And we're going to need that today to talk about when the Israelites come out of Egypt.
Yeah.
So that's why we need to actually now get our structure from the text.
Yeah.
So I need to tell you, though, that it starts on an assumption.
Okay.
So the first thing that we need to know is when was the division of the kingdom?
Okay.
Thiele, a guy that did what's called the Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, back in the 1950s, he wrote a book at University of Chicago and tried to figure out how they all fit together. And he works it back to that about 930, 130, that's 930 or 31.
That's when the split of the kingdom is?
That's when the split of kingdom is. Now, let me just tell you that even if I'm wrong, almost all the scholars that I know are within 10 years of that. So it's
really?
not, so it's not like I'm going to be massive amounts off. It's only going to be maybe 10 years max off.
Yeah.
Okay? So how you do this is the first thing you've got to do is you've got to figure out when Solomon reigned. And Kings tells us that he reigns for 40 years. Okay? So that would so you add 40 onto the 30, 31, and you get like 970 or 971. Yeah. All right? So here's what 2 Kings tells us, or 1 Kings 11. It says that the time Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. So that's where we get the reason I need that is that when you go to 1 Kings 6:1, it's going to use Solomon's dates to help us figure out some things.
Okay.
All right. So 1 Kings 6:1 says, "Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv," okay, which is the second month, "he began to build the house of the Lord."
Yeah.
So I needed to figure out, okay, when is Solomon's reign?
Yeah.
When's the division of the kingdom? Because then I can work backwards from that. And that's how so if we add 480 years onto, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you. So his years, he's going to be 970 or 971. Yeah. Then you take 4 years off, that'll be 966 or 67. And then add the 480 years onto that, you're going to get 1446 or 47. Now it says that's when the Israelites came out of Egypt.
Yeah.
Now, remember, they wander in the wilderness for how long?
40 years. Right?
Yeah. So if you take the 40 years, you can figure out when they actually...
About when they actually left.
Yeah. So you can have they probably go into the promised land about 1406 to go around Jericho and take that, remember?
Yeah.
So you can build a lot based upon this, but we're taking these specific passages and numbers right from the biblical texts themselves. So I wanted people to know that, because it's not like it's a guess. Now, I'm not done, but that'll give us back to the Exodus, and that's what we're going to need for Exodus later.
Yeah.
Okay? But let's keep going. So if the Exodus is about 1446 or 47, then the Israelites, it says, were in Egypt for 430 years, according to Exodus 12, 40 through 41. Here's what it says. Now, the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of heaven went out from the land of Egypt. You don't usually see that phrase, to the very day. Yeah. So, I think what it's telling us is it's really close to this amount of time.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you add that on, then you can actually figure out when they went into Egypt. Okay. So we add on our 430 years and we get to 1876 or 77. Okay. Then we go, we've got a passage in Genesis that actually tells us how old Jacob was when he went into the land. Okay. So it's actually a complaint, but it's kind of cute. But it actually gets us a date. In Genesis 47:9, it says, "So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant they have been the years of my life, nor have they obtained the years that my father lived during the days of their sojourning." So he's actually complaining, but if he hadn't have said that, we would never be able to get back to
even further, right?
So now we can figure out, when was Jacob born?
Yeah.
Okay, so we add our 130 years onto that, and we get 2006 or 7 for his birth.
Yeah.
Now we can go back even further. So if that's Jacob's birth, Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. Remember Jacob and Esau? We've got that. So according to Genesis 25:26, it says, "Afterwards his brother came forth with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob, and Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them."
Right.
So at this point, now we've got 2066 or 67. Now Abraham, remember, he's 100 years old when Isaac was born. So we can add that on, and Abraham would be about 166. 2,166 when he was born.
Yeah.
And so we've got a date from the biblical passage itself.
Yeah.
So little did I know you could actually go from the biblical passage. Now let's say I'm 10 years off. I'm still a whole lot closer than and using the biblical text itself.
Well, and it seems still to match that idea that was going on, that this kind of fits in the historical context of, our understanding of 2000 BC.
Yeah. What's nice, though, is now this can be a whole lot more specific. And it's going to help us get some dates now when they come out of Egypt. Now there is a problem, and we'll talk about that later, but at least now we've got the biblical chronology pretty much set up.
Yeah.
Okay?
Now let me ask you.
Yeah.
What would critics of your opinion on this say?
Yeah.
Like, what's the other idea on this?
Yeah, the other idea is that, here, let's go back to it. They were in Egypt for 480 years.
Yeah.
Some people actually have argued that that's 12 generations. And
it's like a...
And they argue that, at this point, 12 generations would be 40, and that'll give us that 480. But they actually argue that a generation is really only about 20 years, and so it can cut that in half. The problem with that, it doesn't say that it's...
so many generations or something.
It actually gives a specific number.
Yeah.
So it's real hard for me to argue and say, well, you have to do gymnastics to get this. And this is not the only number that you have to mess with. I'll show you later. There's another one. And I'll tell you why the difference is. But there is, I understand that this is the logic and that you can try to reduce the number system.
So basically their assumption would be, instead of years, they're measuring, there's a different kind of measuring stick, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's kind of... not a guess, but it's like an estimation or something like that.
Yeah, and I'll show you another place where they do it. But those are what basically the critics want to get back down to what's called the later date of the Exodus in the 1200s, or 1290 or something like that. I don't think that's doable, but...
And what would that put that... Oh, that 1290, that's where that is the later date.
Yes, that is the later date.
Cutting in half... the amount of time that Israel was in
Egypt. Yeah.
I see.
Now, there's another thing. When we go to that 400 years they were in Egypt. That can be a difficulty because even Genesis 15 actually says that they were going to be servants and wanderers in Egypt for 400 years. So the issue is I think that Genesis 15 is a round number because he's prophesying, telling them about what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It seems like to me the 430 years is a more specific time when he says to the very day. That seems like he's trying to be pretty specific.
Yeah.
One other thing that that we have to decide is because the Septuagint has that they lived in Egypt and in Canaan for 430 years, that would be another way of getting the dates down.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So,
interesting. Okay.
Seems, yeah. So there's a number of things that the people that would question my view.
Sure, yeah. Okay.
All right. Okay. What I wanted to do here is remember, Joseph is one that we kind of need to work on to figure out who are the dates of who are the pharaohs and stuff like that during his time.
Yeah.
He had the dreams when he's 17 years old. Genesis 37 tells us that. All right. He was in prison for 2 years. Genesis 41 tells us that. And then Joseph stood before the king when he was 30 years old. That's what Genesis 41:46. So we're actually getting some time. Now the problem is I don't know exactly when he was born. So that's a difficulty on mine. But because of that, it makes it real difficult to know how those dates fit together.
Yeah.
So Joseph is the one. Remember, he's not one of the patriarchs, so he's not basically one of them that they give a specific date for.
Right.
So they don't use him. So it's more difficult to figure out when his date started and when.
Yeah.
Now we can figure out. We know how long he lived. Genesis 50 tells us he lived for 110 years.
Okay.
So that one we have. And remember the years of plenty or 70 years or 7 years and years of famine.
Yeah.
So anyway, some of these things we've got enough help. So what I've done is I've tried to guess when this could be. So Jacob lived, that's his father, lived about 2006 to about 1859. Those are his dates. And we know he says he lived 17 years in Egypt. So we can subtract that. And Joseph was 30 years when he was
for the king.
For the king, yeah. And then we have 14 years of 7 years of abundance.
Abundance and famine, yeah.
Yeah, no, remember it wouldn't be all the way through the famine because they come after a couple of years into the famine part.
Yeah.
And then they live in Egypt, some of that. So it wouldn't be the whole 14 years.
Yeah.
So it looks like to me that he was born somewhere around 1915. And then that would make him dying about 1805.
Okay.
So that's my guess, and I tried to figure it out based upon the little evidence that we've got. Not as good as I would have liked to have, but it's
a fairly good range.
Yeah, it's close anyway. And then that would put, so if he died in 1805, then that means the pharaohs that he's probably dealing with would be Amenemhet the second or the fourth. Either one of that time frame would be when he was in there. So that gives us some clue. So that helps us know who the pharaohs are.
Yeah.
Now here's the problem. The dates of the pharaohs are much more complicated and somewhat questionable based upon what's called the early date or the later date of the pharaohs.
Okay.
It's kind of complicated, but it depends where they were ruling as to because it talks about them offering the bull each year. There was a specific bull that was offered each year, and it depends whether it was in the north or in the south as to exactly what date it would be. So it can be off. It can be off like 30 to 50 years in some of these because of whether it was in the north or south.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's what makes it so complicated. So it's hard to know exactly who these pharaohs would have been.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. In Exodus 1:8, it says, there rose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. I'm wondering if this would be the Hyksos dynasty. The Hyksos were a foreign group of invaders basically that took over the north, the what we call Upper Egypt or Lower Egypt, where the mouth is. So in the Goshen area, or where we know the Israelites were living.
Yeah.
So in about Exodus 1:8, it says that in that area there was, or at least somewhere, that there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. Mm-hmm. If this is a foreign invader, that would
that would make sense,
it would make a lot of sense. They never heard of him.
Right.
So if Joseph lived in the Middle Kingdom, and I've tried to give you the dates there, it's probably the 12th dynasty, that what we call it in Egypt, and that would give us the 1991 to 1802. Mm-hmm. So somewhere in that time frame is when these are. It's interesting. The 12th dynasty ended with no heirs to carry on the throne.
Wow.
Yeah. So the 13th dynasty was much weaker, and then the 14th dynasty ended up being so weak that the Hyksos took them over. These foreign invaders.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. It's said that they were Asiatic descent. That's why some people who study Egyptian history want to make them the Israelites, because they're kind of the same nationality from that. Yeah. So that would make some sense. The problem is from the biblical dating or chronology, it puts it way too late.
Yeah, it's a very different time.
So, yeah. So I think it makes more sense to say he's the one that doesn't know Joseph, because he's a foreign invader. He wouldn't know him.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
It's very likely that the Pharaoh did not know Joseph because he's the first Hyksos king. That would be a guy named Saladis, about 1650. Okay, so that would give us, I think, pretty good time. The Hyksos did not control all of Egypt, just the Delta area.
End, kind of.
Yeah. So that gives you some clue about who it could be. Yeah. So that was the one evidence. Remember, let's go back. It says there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Egypt, or Joseph. Now, that's not a lot of help, but it's some.
Yeah.
The second one is Exodus 4:19. It says, go back to Egypt, for the men that were seeking your life are dead. Now, remember, Moses is in Midian for 40 years.
Yeah.
So whoever... so he leaves, and whatever happens, apparently the people that are after him die.
Yeah.
Okay. So the givens that there's only 2 pharaohs that appear to rule for at least 40 years, according to Acts 7:30. That's how long he was in Midian. It's not necessary for this to refer to only one pharaoh, though. Right? It could be a family or something like that are really mad at Joseph.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay, that's the Acts passage that says, an angel appeared to, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of the burning thorn bush. So that's the passage that tells us that. Yeah, so that's the givens. Okay, I wanted you to see where Midian was. It's the reason is there's a really good reason why he doesn't stay in the Sinai desert area is that was still controlled by Egypt.
Oh, okay.
So he's actually got to get outside of that.
Yeah,
and Midian would have been a good place then.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I told you that. But remember when he's doing the flocks and stuff like that, when he's shepherding them, one of the places he goes is the burning bush, which is said to be my Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
So he can shepherd his flock in here, but he just doesn't want to. He wants to get outside of that so that Egyptians are hopefully not going to keep following him.
Right.
Yeah. Okay? But that's actually good for Moses, because now he's going to learn about the Sinai desert, because later on he's going to be leading people through that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So that was from there. Okay, now here's the dates. The early date of the Exodus would be like 1446, and the late date would be like 1290. That's round numbers, okay? Here's the evidence for the early date. 1 Kings 6:1, Solomon dedicated the temple 480 years after the Exodus. So that puts it at almost that exact time. The other one is that in Judges 11:26, it says, Israel occupied the land of Canaan for about 300 years by Jephthah's time, which appears to be between 1100 and 1050. Here's what Jephthah's arguing with the people living in the Transjordan area because they want to fight him and kick the people out.
Yeah.
And so Jephthah's arguing, hopefully he doesn't have to go to battle if he can talk them out of leaving the land. So it says, while Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and Or and its villages, and all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why did you not recover them within that time? So that's a pretty good argument. He's saying, well, wait a minute, if this was your land and now you're claiming it's your land,
right? What happened to those 300
years?
Yeah,
why are you letting them live there for 300 years? And the people, the people that, now the other side, they know that passage says that, but they remember I told you that the 1 Kings 6:1 on the late date,
the other side would be,
they're going to argue that it's not,
the generations are shorter.
Yeah, so that's how that works. But then on Jephthah's argument, they say that 400 or 300 years is an exaggeration. But remember what he's trying to do. He's trying to convince these people not to go to war and not kick them out of the land they've been living in. And if you say, okay, so really it was only 150 years instead of the 300, they're going to say, well, you haven't been there that long. You know. So my argument is he's going to have to be pretty accurate because he's trying to convince them not to go to war.
Yeah.
I doubt that if he fudges on the numbers, if that's going to help his argument.
Yeah.
So I don't think it makes much sense to me.
Yeah.
And now, for the other side, there's no evidence of the land of Israel before the Meneptah Stele. The Meneptah Stele, in fact, I have a picture of it for you.
Oh,
here it is.
Oh, I've seen this.
Yeah. Okay, the Meneptah Stele actually claims that they defeated many nations, but one of the most important ones for us is that Israel is named in there.
Yeah.
So it says it sieged upon Gezer, the Yohanan. Nehomam is not existent. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. Karu as a widow become of Egypt. So it's actually specifically talking about it, okay? It also, in that specific passage, it actually says why Asquani, Gezer, and Yohanan have given determinative as a city, which is a throw stick and 3 mountains. The hieroglyphs that refer to Israel instead employ a throw stick, which means foreigner, plus a sitting man and women, which are the determinatives for people. Okay, in Egyptian, there are things called determinatives to let you know what a specific noun is, and these are telling us that these are a people, not just a city or something like that. Yeah. So that is helpful for us. And then there's also 3 vertical lines which let us know that it's plural, so that the people have multiple people.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a really good argument that says, okay, that at least by this time we know that there's a people called Israel that are living in Canaan.
Yeah.
Okay. Now
that they're known.
Yeah.
Like enough that we're gonna say that we beat them.
Good. Now, what is also kind of important is it doesn't say anything about them not being there earlier.
Right.
It just means that when Meneptah came through and did the battle, he wiped them out.
Yeah.
Or at least claimed to. I don't know that he wiped them all the way out, but but he at least defeated them. But the problem
is... It's quite a claim to say there's none left.
Yeah, right. But anyway, so what we've got here is we've got evidence, but we don't have anything that says they weren't there before that.
Yeah.
So that's a weakness on the other side.
Yeah.
Okay. Moses was exiled for 40 years. Okay. During that time, the Pharaoh of the oppression and the only Pharaoh that ruled that long was Thutmose III. Another one was Ramses II, and that's the one they want to argue it is the person that did it. Yeah. So in my mind, you have to do gymnastics with the biblical text to get to Ramses II.
Yeah.
Okay. For the late date, number 4, their next bit of evidence is that Lachish, Jericho, Bethel, Hatzor, and Debir, those were all cities in Canaan. There is a destruction in the 1300s, or 13th century, which is that 1200s.
Yeah.
But remember, the Israelites are only said to have burned 3 cities, Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. In fact, they purposely didn't burn a lot of the other cities because they were going to live in them. So to claim that these ones have a 13th century destruction layer
connected to it.
Yeah, it could have been well after. In fact, we do know that during Ramses' time, he did. There's the Philistines that they actually did battle with and pushed him into that area.
Yeah.
And we know that Meneptah did quite a bit of battle at that time. So to have destruction layers later Doesn't surprise me at all.
Right.
But I think we've got to realize Moses or the Israelites didn't really do a whole lot of burning and destructing of these cities because they were going to be living in them.
Right.
And remember, do you remember a lot of them times they like went like the whole Southern campaign. They went to Gibeon to do the battle, and then they fled, tried to get back to their cities. Well, that was, again, the destruction was hopefully get them before they could get back to their cities.
Right,
and again, then you wouldn't have to destroy the city.
Yeah.
So the logic of what it tells us does not suggest that there should be any destruction layers.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So that's more evidence. The Meneptah mentions Israel. Okay, we've already talked about that. Mm-hmm. The Amarna letters in the 1400s actually mention a period of chaos caused by the Habiru. Now, the Habiru sounds a lot like Hebrew.
Oh.
But we know that
That's interesting.
Yeah, we do know that the Habiru were from a larger area than where the Israelites were. So you have them up in Syria, and you have them over in like Babylon, where the Habiru are. So what we think is that the Habiru were called foreigners or invaders or something like that, and they were thought to be taking over land. And probably that's how the Egyptians would have seen the Israelites.
Right.
So my understanding is that the Israelites could have been a part of the Habiru, just it's just not an equation of them.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. If you put if you have the date at 1400, that means that there's going to be about 250 years for the time of the judges. And two of the judges' time things, it says that they had rest for 90 years. And that's two of them. So already you've got 180 years of supposed rest. Now, the problem is that these judges were probably from different parts of the country.
Yeah.
But still, to have two of them saying that there's 90 years of peace, you'd have to have a pretty good time of peace for that to even make any sense.
Yeah.
So that would seem like to me that to push it down to 180 years is not going to be enough time to get all those judges in that time period.
Yeah.
Okay? The dream stele of Thutmose IV indicates that he was not supposed to be the pharaoh, but somehow he does become the pharaoh. So we wonder if, maybe it was the 10th plague that wiped out his brother.
Oh, wow.
So that now he gets to be.
Wow.
Now, I don't push too much on that because that would be really amazing if that was possible.
Yeah.
But even at that point, at least there's some evidence suggesting that for some reason the firstborn is not able to do it and he gets in there.
Right.
So I think that's helpful. Okay. Now we've talked about the evidence for the early date, okay? The problem with the evidence for the late date would be Joseph enters Egypt. Makes a lot of sense if that was during the Hyksos time period because they already would have known that. But remember, in my mind, that's not necessarily that good an argument because remember, the Egyptians, the whole reason Joseph can actually do what he's doing is because of this great wisdom that God had given him to know how to deal with it. Yeah. So he's got to have an Egyptian pharaoh that trusts him enough to actually allow him to do it. So if all of a sudden they've just been taken over by this Asiatic group, it seems unlikely then that we're going to allow then Joseph to take over, from a pharaoh to have that much authority.
Yeah.
So it would seem like it would be talked about differently.
Yeah.
They conquered and then they took over. Well, that's not what it says. Okay. And then Edom, Moab, and Ammonite are not around in the 14th century. That's no longer thought to be true. That evidence is based on a guy that had done all of evidence in the early 1900s, and then they found out that it wasn't true at all. There's a lot more people over there than they thought were. Yeah. So more recent excavations have shown that's
archaeological.
Not true. Yeah. So number 6 is not even true anymore. Now here's the biggest evidence for a late date. The city is called Ramses. And it was probably started by Seti I, but then finished by Ramses II. Now that would make some sense. Why would it be called Ramses if you don't have a pharaoh calling it that?
Right.
I mean, it's possible it could be dedicated to somebody else. And we do know of a guy named Ramos, which is it would be the same roots of Ramses, who was a a vizier, so he had a lot of power. And it's possible that it could have been named after him because he was powerful enough that he could have done that.
Yeah.
But we also know that Ramses II took a lot of credit for things that he didn't always do. Right. Like I was in Egypt once, and I actually saw a statue that had his name Ramses carved into it. But initially, it was somebody else's statue. So he was known for taking credit for stuff. So he would take over statues or things like that and put his own name in there. Yeah. So he had actually chiseled it out and actually put his name in there.
So the name a city after himself.
Yeah. So
fits the.
Yeah, and it would make sense that this could have been a city already earlier, but now it gets renamed. Now remember, we've talked also about places being renamed. Remember in Genesis 14:14, we actually talked about Dan being called Dan before it was ever called that. And the biblical text even tells us that.
Yeah.
So my guess is that in the copying process, they modified the city name. It could have been its original name, and then they changed it to that. I have a feeling that could have happened here too. So it was called something earlier, and now they changed it to Ramses because Ramses took it over in the 1200s.
And that's how people would know it.
Yeah. So anyway, so here's the problems. The problems is, how do you explain Exodus 1:11, that name Ramses before? This is
for the early Exodus.
These are problems for the early one, And then why so little evidence for Israel?
Outside evidence.
Other than that Merneptah stealing.
Yeah.
Well, part of my answer to that is, well, remember, they're taking over a country. They're not a big people. I mean, they're not.
Right.
They're so even that we've got them talked about in the Merneptah Stele is kind of amazing. It would seem like to me. Yeah. So that's the problems on that side. The problems on the late date is, how do you explain the biblical evidence, both the 480 years and the Judges 1130?
Yeah.
Both of those seem to really strong evidence against that late date.
Yeah.
And then I would probably even say there's one more. Having those judges in such a small time period is a problem also.
Kinda.
Yeah. All right. So does that make sense?
I think so.
So we've got a later date and an earlier date.
Yeah.
I actually argue for the earlier date, and I do it basically because of the evidence from the biblical text.
Yeah.
Most people that argue for the later date usually do it because of the evidence from Egypt. You know, because of the pharaohs having so much problem.
Yeah.
They think it fits better in that later time period. But most of the time, they're getting evidence from the Egyptian area, not the biblical area.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So at least that was our complicated part this time. Sorry about that.
Well, there's a lot of dates in there, but I think this is helpful.
Yeah.
It's helpful to give us some context, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be important. See, I had to go through the biblical text showing where all that goes back all the way to Abraham, so that we could get some chronology to help us on this.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So if the early date is true, a guy named Thutmose III is probably the pharaoh of the oppression, and Amenhotep II probably the pharaoh of the Exodus. If it's a late date, it's probably Ramses I, who would be and Seti, probably both of those would be pharaohs of the oppression, because you remember you have to have a decent time period.
Yeah.
And then the pharaoh of the Exodus would be Ramses II.
Yeah.
All right. Now, another thing, we hadn't talked about, or we mentioned it, but I didn't say it yet. We must determine whether we believe that the Israelites were in Egypt for 180 years, as the Hebrew Bible says, or if the 80 years includes both the time in Canaan and Egypt, as the Septuagint says. So in my mind, I would always take the MT over the Septuagint, unless I have really good reasons not to.
Yeah.
There are places where we know that the Septuagint modifies the text to help soften problems or to work through things.
Yeah.
So it would seem like to me, I would feel more confident going with the MT, the Hebrew Bible, assuming that it has the logic that the scribes were maintaining during that time period.
Yeah.
So I would actually prefer the MT over the Septuagint most of the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a bit of textual criticism.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. All right. Okay, so now that we've got that, So we've talked about the two problems, and one of them is that they argue that it makes the most sense of the city after a reigning pharaoh, and we know that's true. The Exodus 1:11.
Yeah.
But the name Ramos, we do know precedes Ramses and goes back at least to Amenhotep III, which would put it in the 1400s.
Okay.
So we know that a name like that, and he was like something like a vizier, so he was a pretty powerful person.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's that. We talk two possibilities. A later scribe may have changed it.
Yeah, like Dan.
Yeah. So we've got that. Or it's and I actually gave you the information there. We already talked about it before. I even talk about. Remember when we talked about Leshem and Laish? That there was two. If you go to Joshua 19:47, it actually says the name of Dan was called Leshem rather than Laish, because in Judges 18:29 it actually says it's Laish.
Yeah.
But remember, the Hebrew text was not pointed at initially, so really the only issue you really have is the mem on the end.
Yeah.
Well, that M that I circled there, that at the end, can also be called memation, and memation sometimes indicates a noun. So if it's put on the end of a word, it might tell us that that's a noun or a name of something.
Yeah, like a proper noun. Yeah.
And this one Laish may not have that on. And one other thing that's pretty important that you need to know is that a yod usually indicates some kind of an IE class, and the leshem is more of an E class. But in Hebrew, an IE class are the same. So in their minds, they would be equivalent. And so to have them say, now one other thing that I haven't told you is I don't know actually what language Leshem or Laish is in. Because remember, this is a city before the Hebrews came in, Israelites came in.
Yeah.
So even if the Israelites were using Hebrew to explain it, they're trying to explain a name.
Yeah, they're approximating.
Yeah, probably from another language, maybe Canaanite.
Yeah.
So they're doing the best they can do with the letters they have to make it, at least close to what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
So that's one other thing that
it's an interesting challenge. This is maybe a bizarre example of that, but so my wife is from Hawaii.
Okay.
And the first church in Hawaii is still standing.
Okay.
It's in Kona, or maybe it's at least the first one on the Big Island.
Okay.
And they have all kinds of. We visited it, and they have like a little kind of museum area almost. They have all kind of stuff, but they have letters. From very early European and American settlers or explorers writing about the islands they found. And the names are the same, but they're spelled completely differently. But it's because you're trying to approximate how Native Hawaiians were describing the land in English.
Yeah.
And as we developed, we found better ways to make it sound correct.
And remember, lexicons or dictionaries didn't come around until the 1900s, really.
Right.
Now, there was some standardization before that, but much later than what we would think.
Yeah. And you're trying to take something you're hearing and put it into your own
language or
characters
sounds.
And everything. Yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Second possibility is that Ramses was known to take credit for other people's work. So I wished I had the picture. I had a picture at one time of that statue. I wished I still had it. I don't have it anymore.
It's a bold move.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So in chapter 1 of Exodus, so now we've got the dating taken care of to the best of our ability. The Israelites were in Egypt for about 70 years to the end of Genesis. Then this, remember, was about 300 years later. So they were actually slaves for quite a long time. Now, remember, they're not slaves all that time period. They were, for a long time, they lived
in the land.
And it was fine. Yeah. But towards the end, apparently, the slavery got so bad that now they want to leave.
Violent.
Yeah, right. Okay, and we talked about the 70 Israelites when they came in. Okay, so it is interesting that they multiplied so numerously that now they're afraid of them. And that would make some sense if maybe even later on we've got stuff like the Hyksos coming in and overruling some of these. So now that's going to be later, but that gives us some clue that maybe the Egyptians weren't as strong as we thought they were. So it does make some sense.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a picture of where Pithom and Ramses probably are. Those are probably as close as we're going to get.
Yeah.
Okay. Then This has always been a question that students always bring up to me. Why did God bless the midwives when they lied? Right? Because in Exodus it says that God was good to the midwives and the people multiplied and became very mighty.
Yeah.
But he's blessing them, but they're lying to say that the Israelites are so vigorous that by the time we get there, the child's already born.
Right.
Well, that wasn't actually true. The midwives were helping them.
Yeah.
So my guess is that it's the greater good or lesser evil kind of argument in morality that it's either killing somebody, which we know is wrong, or lying. We know that's wrong too.
Yeah.
But it would be a lesser evil. So you don't kill somebody because that'd be worse than lying.
Yeah.
So somehow they were having to make up their choices and make a decision as to what they were going to do based upon what they felt was more correct.
Yeah.
And so that's my guess, is that what was happening is God's blessing them because they're doing their greater good or a lesser evil kind of thing.
Do you think that fits in with the idea of like shrewdness as well?
Maybe.
'Cause that's kind of an interesting concept, I think, of kind of what does that mean, kind of, like if you're being shrewd, are you completely misrepresenting the truth, or are you kind of positioning things to be beneficial?
Yeah.
It's challenging,
And yet we know that even a half lie is a lie, right? I mean, so we need to make sure we hold the line on what is really true and what is not. When we had kids, it was really hard to make sure they knew. Sometimes they would lie because they knew that if they didn't, they'd get in trouble.
Yeah.
Well, so they were doing basically what they thought was a lesser good, greater evil kind of thing. But we had to teach them that no, even a half lie is lying, or even deceiving somebody is lying.
Yeah.
So you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So it gets really hard. But in a situation like this, I think the midwives had to make up their mind.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? We're going to kill people, or are we going to lie about it?
Right.
And God's going to bless them for protecting His people.
Yeah.
Okay. Moses was from a Levite family. That's going to be important later on. They try to hide him for 3 months. Now you haven't had children yet, have you?
No.
So to try to hide a baby that's crying times and stuff. I mean, some kids are very colicky and stuff that. So that could be, for 3 months, could have been a really real pain.
Yeah.
Anyway, they built an ark, and I tried to get you a picture of what it would look like. It's called an ark, but it would be like a bulrush basket. So they'd get it from around the Nile River, and make something like that to put him in.
Yeah.
Okay, then Pharaoh's daughter called him Moses, it says, because she drew him out of the water. And so I looked, Mashah actually does to mean draw out, and it's used 3 other times in the biblical passage, or in Old Testament.
Yeah.
So I thought, initially I thought it was just a kind of like a popular etymology.
Oh, yeah.
But apparently it's used enough that it actually does mean that.
Yeah.
So that's good. All right. Now, another problem is Moses' father-in-law. What is his name? Okay? So in Exodus 2:18 it says, and they came to Reuel, their father, and said, why have you come back so early? So there it sounds like their father's name is Reuel. Then in Exodus 3:1, it says, now Moses was pasturing the flocks of Jethro, his father-in-law. So there it seems like he's called Jethro.
Yeah.
And then in Numbers 10:29 it says, and Moses said to Hobab, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. So the question is, okay, let's say that the Hobab is the father of Reuel. Okay? Because then it's Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. So it would be Reuel. But we still got, is he Jethro or is he Reuel?
Yeah.
And I think there's several possibilities. It is possible that he has 2 names. Because remember, Abraham gets his name changed. So it's possible that this guy could have had his name changed. Or it's also possible that Reuel is maybe the patriarch of the family. So when they came, he was actually the first one they met. It wasn't actually... It wasn't actually Jethro they met, but the patriarch of the family. And then they said, why are you back so soon? And so it could be that. When it says their father, that could mean like their grandfather, their great-grandfather.
Yeah.
So my wondering is if the Reuel is maybe he's the patriarch so that and he can actually call him their father because he's in their line.
And Jethro In Exodus 3:1, it particularly describes Jethro's
that one is really specific. Yeah,
that does.
Yeah. So those are the possibilities.
That's interesting.
It's just a dilemma that you need to somehow figure out.
Right.
So I thought I'd help you. All right. Moses flees to Midian. Here's that map that shows you that was all Egyptian domain.
Yeah.
So I thought that was helpful.
Yeah, all the way into Mount Sinai.
Yeah. Okay, then Jethro was a priest, it said, and he had 7 daughters. And he gave him Zipporah, that means little bird, the name Zipporah, to Moses for a wife. And he had a son named Gershom, which means a stranger here. Later on, he's going to have another son too, and we'll see that, and I'll show you where it is. One of the important things is that Exodus chapter 3:14. When he's calling Moses, God's calling Moses. One of the things that he does is he actually says, what am I going to tell him is your name? If I go back to Egypt, how are they going to know you?
Yeah.
And he says to call him, I am who I am, basically. Yeah. I actually think it's a play on the word Yahweh. So here's, if this is going to be really tough, sorry about this, but if you have a yod at the beginning, so the beginning of that word there means it's third person. Mm-hmm. So he is or he is.
Okay.
If it's in first person, it would be I am or I will be. Mm-hmm. So I think what's happening is he's playing on the word, so that if you're talking, if God's talking about himself, he's saying I am, and he's using the first common singular form. But if you're talking about him, you'd use the third person form. He is. So I actually think it was a play on the word Yahweh, or of the name Hayah. To make it's that verb to be.
Yeah.
And so if I'm talking about him, it'd be third person.
Yeah.
He is, and first. So the third person form looks very similar to Yahweh, our name there.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably what's going on. It's a play on the name.
That's interesting.
Yeah. That one's a complicated one, but you still got a problem with the wow instead of a yod. But I actually know that in the copying process, several times the yods and wows look real similar, especially in Qumran material. So it could be that gets corrupted or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's that issue. I hope that one's not too complicated, because that's kind of
that's an interesting
Hebrew text itself.
We might need to look at that one in another episode.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of cool. That'd be kind of interesting to kind of maybe show
the changes and stuff.
That could be kind of fascinating.
Okay.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Everyone knows that passage.
Yeah. All right. So Exodus 3:15 says, God further said to him, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my memorial name to all generations. I thought that was really interesting. So he's going to say that the name Yahweh is going to be his memorial name or his covenant name through all generations. So I thought that was helpful to understand that this is now going to be his name that he's going to be known by from now on. Yeah. And he's letting you know that he's the same God of the fathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right.
But now you know me as Yahweh.
Yeah.
So I thought that's actually a very important verse.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Moses is given 3 signs. Remember, one is a staff to a serpent. The other, he can put his hand in his clothes and comes leprosy. Yeah. And the last one is water to blood.
Yeah.
So my guess is that God knew it was still going to be really hard. Even if he said, okay, tell him I am has sent you.
Yeah.
He's still going to have to now confirm that this is the guy who's going to, because they're now going to have to flee Egypt.
Yeah.
So unless they've got some pretty convincing
good demonstration of authority.
Yeah. So I thought those would be pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I thought it was also funny when God comes to Moses, he does not want to do it.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm shocked. In verse 10 it says, and Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in recently nor in times past, nor since you've spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Now I don't know exactly what that means, but it probably means he's not a real fluent communicator, at the very least. Now, it could mean he has a speech impediment or something like that, but at least he's saying, I can't do it, God.
Yeah.
Okay? Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth, or who makes him mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? What a brilliant answer to Moses saying, I just can't do this, God.
I made you this way.
Yeah. In fact, I can fix it if I want.
Right, yeah.
but I've left you the way you are because that's how I want you.
Yeah.
So it was interesting what God said to him. But I think it's also interesting that God lets him off, right?
Yeah.
So then the anger of the Lord burned against Moses, and he said, Is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he speaks fluently. I wonder what that means. He must be really talkative.
Yeah.
And moreover, behold, he's coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. I thought that was interesting that God lets him off.
Yeah.
So I think what happened is that Moses was so convinced he could not do it that God knew that. And he was not going. He could probably convince him if he has to, but why force something you don't have to?
Yeah.
And I assume God says, you know what? I'm going to let you out of this one.
Yeah.
And then, moreover, he says, he shall speak for you to the people, and he will be a mouth for you, and you will be as God to him. I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. Yeah. So that means that when he says something, Aaron better say exactly what he says,
right? Because
it's as if God's speaking through him.
Yeah.
So I thought all of those was really helpful to understand the process that's going on. All right, the next one. He gets ready to go to Egypt. And remember, God speaks to him again. And then you have that Zipporah incident where she calls him a bridegroom of blood. Okay, let me read it for you. Yeah. Now, it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. And Zipporah took a flint knife and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it on at Moses' feet and said, "You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me." Wow. First of all, now we've got our first family feud kind of thing going on. But it's interesting. Between 24 and 25, you don't have Zipporah and Moses speaking even. Right. It sounds like they already knew what the issue was. Now think about it. God had told Abraham that if you're going to be a part of my nation, you're going to be circumcised.
Right.
And now you've got Moses, who his own son is not circumcised. I think what you've got here is you've got God being really upset and saying, I can't have one of my spokesmen not obeying the rules because I've already told you this is how you guys are supposed to demonstrate you're part of the covenant. Yeah. And if you're not part of the covenant, then you're not circumcised. And I assume Zipporah had a problem with that.
Yeah.
You know, maybe the Midianites didn't circumcise their kids. Right. And so I assume she wasn't going to do it. And then when she finds out how serious God is, she goes ahead and does it. Yeah. But she doesn't sound very happy about it, does it? Does she?
No, not at all.
All right, does that make some sense?
Yeah.
That's one that almost everybody will bring up to me and say, what's going on here?
Yeah.
But actually, it makes a lot of sense if you've got Moses, who's going to be the spokesman for Israel, for God, and his own son's not following what God told him.
Yeah.
So it makes sense, I think. All right, then we got the 10 plagues. Okay, Nile to blood, frogs, gnats, insects. So you've got all this. What I thought is interesting is that God allowed the magicians to do the first two.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that God knows what he's doing. Mm-hmm. So he's actually doing this so that it makes it harder for Pharaoh to believe. You know, if his magicians can do it, then in their minds, their God's as strong as
There's
Yahweh.
No particular authority.
Right. Once they can't do it anymore, they even say to Pharaoh, you better worry about this God because we cannot do this.
Yeah.
So this God is more powerful than us.
Yeah.
So I think that actually helped that at that point then to have even people religious people within their own nation saying, this God is stronger than we can handle.
Yeah.
So I thought that was funny. Oh, not funny, but helpful.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Then we've got, you've got. So at first you've got that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and then it's got at some point Pharaoh's hardening his own heart. And my understanding is that the first couple, God is actually hardening Pharaoh's heart or helping it to be hardened.
Yeah.
Pharaoh was already wanting to go in that direction. Anyway, I think God's just helping nudge him in that direction.
Yeah.
But then at a certain point, he doesn't have to help him anymore. Pharaoh does it all on his own.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And then almost every time Pharaoh is willing, not every time, but a bunch of the times, he's willing at first, and then he changes his mind. Yeah. So the last one, he's very willing. In fact, he says, I don't ever want to see you again. He makes that real clear. If he sees him, he's killing him.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing I forgot to tell you, the people are even angry at Moses at some point. Remember, they keep getting every time Pharaoh or Moses goes to Pharaoh, it just keeps getting harder and harder on them.
Right.
So now they're having to make the same amount of bricks, only they don't get the stubble that they used to before.
Right. Yeah.
So at some point, even they're pretty angry with their leader.
Yeah.
So I just thought you should see that because that happens, and I guess we got to realize God knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, what's kind of interesting is there is some structure to these. Like he meets Pharaoh at the river. Moses meets Pharaoh at the riverbank in the first and the fourth and the seventh plague. Then he meets him in his residence in the second, the fifth, and the eighth ones. And then Pharaoh has no warning in the third, the sixth, and the ninth plagues.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and now there's more too. Aaron holds out his staff in the first and through thirds. Pharaoh's heart is first plague. He says Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. That word kabed can be heavy or stubborn even.
Yeah.
Hazak means it to be hard. So the first plague, his heart is both stubborn and hard.
Yeah.
Then in the second one, now he's using the word kabed, which is that hardened or heavy. And then the last one is, in the third one is his heart is strong or hard.
Yeah.
Then in the first two of the fifth or the fourth through the sixth, the first two the Lord did it, and then the next one Moses does it. Mm-hmm. So I thought that's kind of interesting. Pharaoh's heart was it was kabed, it was stubborn, and the fifth one is stubborn, and then the sixth one. So all of those middle ones, his heart was hardened, kind of. All right, and then the ninth through the 11th, Moses stretches out his hand, and in the ninth or seventh plague, his heart is hardened and stubborn and hard.
Kind of like the first plague.
Yeah, and then the plague was hard, and now it's going to match the next
set of
two.
Three.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's so fascinating.
You've got some similarities in there that I thought are helpful.
It's so cool to see this, I think. It's kind of, I think it's hard to catch sometimes in English.
Because it's spread out over such a broad time period too.
Yeah. But that is such a great, that's such a fast, I think it demonstrates, it demonstrates a lot, but one thing it really demonstrates is I think the, kind of the quality of the writing and the thoughtfulness of the writing of putting this together.
Yeah.
It really shows some of the structural elements in this.
Which I think is important too.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, this is one thing that you don't think about, but it says that Israel plundered Egypt on their way out.
Yeah.
35, chapter 11 says, chapter 12. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered Egypt, the Egyptians. It actually says that in the biblical text. So I thought, it's something you don't think about, but that's happening. Yeah. But otherwise, how would the Israelites have gotten the gold and stuff that they're going to need to make the tabernacle?
Yeah.
They're in the middle of the wilderness.
Yeah.
And so God actually gets it from the Egyptians.
And they give it to them.
Yeah. So I thought that was important. And then every firstborn in Egypt will die, and Pharaoh will let the people go. Yeah. I wanted you to see this passage. It came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Wow, and that word cattle is probably more general. It probably means more kind of more kind of animals. Yeah. But that's gotta be. Imagine if you were in Egypt when that happened.
Cataclysmic.
Yeah, man. But Pharaoh knew it was coming. So why they couldn't have gotten out of it? I guess they could have. They just didn't believe it.
Right.
So I thought that was helpful.
Yeah.
Then you're going to have the Passover. A Passover lamb is talked about. That's on the 10th of the first month. The lamb is to be killed and the blood put on the post, so that the angel knows which ones to pass over. Mm-hmm. I thought one other thing that was interesting is it says that a mixed multitude went out from them, along with their flocks, their herds, and their large number of livestock. You don't really think about it, but there must have been some Egyptians and other people that actually did believe that this God could do what he said he was going to do. And you've got, remember now there's going to be a lot of Israelites anyway.
Yeah.
But now add that to this mixed multitude that goes with him.
Right.
And now you can see why you're going to have, it says that he's going to have 600,000 soldiers or men that could go to battle. Well, if they've got that many, then think about all the wives and kids that they're going to have.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
But they're going to have kids and stuff like that too.
Right.
So, and then you got this mixed multitude. So
yeah, whoever else is added to that.
Yeah. So, all right. Then Pharaoh pursued Israel. Remember that with his 600 select chariots.
Yeah.
He doesn't probably take his whole army because he doesn't need to. The chariots are so that he can go quickly. Now remember, they've been slaves, so he doesn't expect them to have anything like weapons or anything. So he's not too worried about that.
Right.
He just needs to be able to have enough people to circle them and stop them. Yeah. And then dividing the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, it's called, and then to have it come back on the Israelites or the Egyptians.
Yeah.
So that's a great story, and but it's something we all need to remember.
Yeah.
All right. So now we've left Egypt. Now we're heading to Sinai. So this is the next part.
This is the second section, basically.
Yeah, and this one's kind of important because remember, we don't think about where these people are going, but there are places where, like one's called Elam. Well, we probably know where that is, and so first thing that happens is they get out in the desert. And remember, they're kind of wandering around. They're not heading directly to cross the Red Sea and stuff like this to give the Egyptians the impressions that they don't know where they're going. Once again, that might have been God's plan to get them thinking, oh, well, we can easily go get these people. And so when they do, God gets them.
Yeah, there's a big cost to that. Yeah.
All right, so there's our picture. This is the first one they come to. It's a place, well, first of all, I need to tell you, after 3 days, they get to a place called Mara, which means bitter. But I don't know, if you've been out in the desert for very long, and 3 days is a long time.
Yeah.
My guess is that they brought some water with them. I mean, it'd be stupid not to.
Yeah.
But after 3 days, I'm assuming it's going to run out.
Yeah.
So they get to a place called Mara, which has got bitter water. They actually have a place called Mara today, and that's the well that's there. So I just thought, no, this is probably a legitimate place in the Sinai Desert.
Yeah.
And my guess is that there being no water was a test to see if they were going to complain against God. Because remember, he's going to do the manna and stuff like that too, and make sure, like he gives them manna and he gives them meat, but both times, even at that point, the Israelites didn't always obey. Like sometimes they would gather too much and it would spoil.
Right.
Then on the Sabbath day, they were to gather the day before, they were to gather twice as much.
Yeah.
And then it didn't spoil. See, almost every day, that meant they had a new appreciation, I would have thought, for God's power.
Right.
Because he can do this, and he's teaching them all the way along that they better obey him.
Yeah.
And I remember about the meat, the quail, and they even it says that even when it was in their mouth, he started to punish them.
Yeah.
So anyway, I thought it was important that we realize that basically God's in a teaching mode all the way through the desert.
There's purpose to the wandering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's the next place. It's called Elam. And it says that there's 70 palm trees there. Yeah. The problem is they got there, and again, there was no water. I mean, and today apparently it does have springs in there, but I don't know how reliable they are.
Sure. Yeah.
And anyway, so they had problems at this point, and that's when God splits the rock and provides the water.
Comes, yeah.
All right. They got to Rephidim. And that's probably a picture of that. And again, they didn't have water. This time Moses strikes the rock. Do you remember he was just supposed to speak to it?
Oh, yeah.
And he strikes it, and then Moses gets... God actually says, because you didn't honor me before the people and do as I told you, now you're going to be punished and not going to the promised land.
Yeah.
So it was a serious blow. But it was because... it was treating God lightly, did not do what God had told him to.
Right.
So I can understand it. It's just a very harsh.
I mean, this maybe even ties back into Moses' son not being circumcised, it seems like Moses too isn't totally aware of everything that's supposed to, how they are supposed to interact with God necessarily, and they're constantly overreaching or kind of making assumptions that are bad, which a lot of that gets, I think, straightened out in the second half of Exodus. Lots of order.
Yeah, a lot of people dying in that part.
Well, that's true too. Yeah.
All right, so we got God providing water. Strike. Oh, you know what I thought was interesting is even though he strikes the rock, God still provided the water. The Israelites needed the water. So I mean, he still had to do that, but Moses gets punished for that also. So then they have fighting of the Amalekites. Remember lifting up the hands and when the hands are up, when Moses' hands are up, they're defeated, and when they're down, it was also interesting that Joshua was doing the leading of that battle. So that's actually helpful. In chapter 17, also Jethro comes and brings Moses' family with him, and my response is, why did he have them? I remember because initially he takes off with his family. My guess is that when it started getting bad, he probably sent his family away so that they didn't get harmed. Because who knows what Pharaoh would have done to Moses' family. So that's my guess. But at that point, he says he has two children. One is Gershom and one is Eleazar.
Okay.
Yeah. So I thought that was helpful. The names are pretty important. Gershom means a stranger here. Remember that was the first one. And then Eleazar means God is my help. So my guess is that that's a reflection of what Moses thinks during the process. So I think it's pretty important. At that same time, Jethro helps him to not get so worn out. Remember, he tells him to divide the responsibility up and don't judge everybody. And So that was actually helpful. Jethro it seems like
some wisdom.
A great leader too. Then they get to Mount Sinai. Here's my pictures of that. I think Mount Sinai is at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula there. You can see it. This is St. Catherine's Monastery, which is built at the bottom of Mount Sinai today. And then these are some pictures of what it would look like.
Wow.
Now remember, Mount Sinai is not just one mountain. It's a range of mountains. And I assume he was on the highest one. I have no idea, but I assume that's right. So it's helpful to at least be able to see it. All right, here's our conclusions. All right, there's about 300 years between the book of Genesis and Exodus. I think that's important for us to remember for that time situation. And then Moses does not want to be God's spokesman, and God lets him off. I think that's actually kind of interesting because remember, God doesn't let Jonah off.
That's true.
So I think what it meant is that Moses was willing, but he felt he didn't have the ability, and God honored that. And so I actually like that. So, and then God almost kills Moses for disobedience, and now that probably makes a lot more sense than it did, because here's Moses, the leader of God's people, who's not even following what God tells him to do. So I can see why God's very upset with that, and I can see why Zipporah is maybe a little upset, but also she better realize that Moses has got a job for God, and he better do it well. So that's part of that. And then Moses was a perfect person to lead the Israelites through the Sinai desert. Think about it. He had 40 years to learn that desert, leading sheep in that area. And I'm going, how a normal person, that's not part of our training. That would be something that would be so foreign to us.
I mean, terrifying.
But Moses was pretty familiar with it. He knew probably where the wells are. He knew where to go when his sheep needed pasturing and stuff. And remember, Moses is going to have flocks and herds with them also when they walk through. So I assume he's that perfect person for that. And the reason he is because God had him flee out of Egypt to Midian.
To go across there
for that.
Anyway. Right.
So I thought that was really helpful.
That's really interesting.
So those are the kind of things I thought were important for us to remember out of this. And then the one other thing is the dating of this, and to remember that the biblical text actually does have a core of information there that helps us to know when these people were born, and you can use that to help determine it. So I'm afraid it was a little complicated towards the beginning. I hope it all made sense.
Yeah, I think it'll be good. And I think, well, what are some good resources maybe people could have to kind of, if they want to read more about this, kind of go through some of these dates? And
I hate to do this to you, but I have a book on history.
Oh, man. I didn't even think about this.
Walter Kaiser and I
should have made it more of a setup. Probably, huh?
Sorry. We did a history book, and part that may be really helpful is I tried to get a lot of pictures for their the wilderness wandering, so that they would know that these places that they're going to are actually legitimate places and stuff.
Yeah.
And then I also tried to give them the evidence for the earlier dates for the Exodus.
Yeah.
So they can see that.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
Sorry about that.
A history of Israel.
I hate to do that to you, but
plug. Yeah. Actually, you should probably. Maybe this is we've been talking about sponsorship deals. Maybe you're the sponsor.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. What a deal.
Well, that was really helpful. That was a lot of information, but I think that was really helpful.
And I think it'll help us understand at least. Now, we still have got the last part of Exodus, but this gets us up into the main core of the book and gives us a lot of information to help us understand the book better, hopefully.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to the next one.
All right. See ya.